Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling, award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers from coast to coast, the Gulf to Canada, and around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio on your AM stations and on video on YouTube and Rumble and the whole 9 yards. Reed Lance Rosenthal, the Cowboys Take. And I keep forgetting to ask, and I keep getting reminded by my producers, please, if you're watching the videos, hit the subscribe, hit that bell. That'll let you know when a new video comes out. There's just one a week. And leave a comment or whatever. Hit the like. It really helps. And it helps me bring you more interviews, which helps you with your knowledge, which helps you with all sorts of things that, why don't we just say you need to be focused on right now with the world kind of going to hell in a handbasket. Intentionally driven, by the way, by the elites and the cabal. But we talk about that every week. So this week, number one, let me clear up a little business. Harvard Gold, great gals. They do a wonderful job. I'm mostly a land guy, right? I like land. But everybody should have a little bit of silver and a little bit of gold, or as much as you wish, if that is your stick, so to speak, because sometime in your future is a CBDC. Now, maybe it'll be delayed if Trump gets elected. It won't be delayed too long if Obama gets in for his 4th term. But if you want to have any privacy, you want to have any latitude, I suggest you take the steps to prepare now. Go to the preparedness page on the rightsideradio.com, and there's all sorts of links there for Harvard Gold. There's a link for them on the homepage there. Here's a really cool thing. Okay, not only do they give you, kind of help you out with discounts and stuff, I think it's $250 first time buyer if you're mentioning our name. But number two, they used to have a $10,000 minimum, and they still do, which is a lot of money for a lot of folks, most folks. But just for the listeners on my radio show and the viewers on my video channels, once every 60 days, they will allow you to buy just $5,000 as a minimum, which is a doable amount. Take advantage of that, folks. I strongly recommend it, and I strongly recommend them. They are first-class, conservative, know what they're doing, and will spend the time with you that you need. Okay, so today's show, we're going to, of course, have the rant story, and we're going to have the founder's quotes, and we're going to have all that fun stuff, right? But I'm going to bring you, as I promised last week, the history of the EPA. Quite interesting how this monster has, shall we say, grown tentacles over the years from its original, we'll give the devil some credit, its original benign, in fact, maybe beneficial intent. But that's kind of, by the wayside. So I'm going to bring you that history, and then I'm going to bring you the rest of the story, right? Because there's always the rest of the story. And then I'm going to bring you up to speed on some of the, shall we say, land grabs and property grabs which are going on that we haven't covered in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And if you haven't listened to those shows or watched those videos, may I strongly suggest you do. Last week was the BLM, history and running amok. And the week before was the attack on your house. That's right, folks. They're not just after farms, ranches, and land. They're after your front door. You will be their tenant in your own home, and everyone else will be a serf on their own land. That really, really, really is what they have planned. That is their goal. Trust me, there is no BS on this, okay? And you need to be aware, and you need to prepare. Aware and prepare those are the catchwords. And practice those words. No, I will not comply. Great words. One of the finest phrases in the English language. So I'll tell you what, let's start off with our founders' quotes. And we're going to start off with John Adams, right? Great patriot. quote, no part of the property of any individual with justice can be taken from him or applied to public uses without his own consent or that of the respective body of the people, unquote. And let's go to John Dickinson, another one of the founders and a great patriot. Terrific quote, right in line with our shows. Quote, let these truths be indelibly impressed on our minds. Number one, that we cannot be happy without being free. Number two, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property. Number three, that we cannot be secure in our property if without our consent, others may as by right take it away. Wow, how true, right? How true. And let me tell you about the ranch story, right? Okay, so last week I kind of brought you up to speed on the, shall we say, wayward attempt to start haying early that was forestalled by about 3 inches of rain 2 days or a day before we were set to gear up the machines and start doing the swathing, cutting the hay. Well, so we rearranged everything for this week and we gave it a couple days to dry out. And it was nice and hot and sunny. It was perfect. And of course, and I record these shows, by the way, the day before the release. So I usually record them on Thursdays. They release on Fridays. And guess what? It's sprinkling out. And they're saying perhaps severe thunderstorms. So, you know, the best laid plan of mice and men and ranchers and people who want to hay oftentimes go astray. So what's the moral of this little story? And I'll let you know what the result is next week, of course. I hope I'll let you know what the result is next week. The moral of this story is if you plan and it falls through, then plan again. And one of these days, a fairy tale can come true. It can happen to you, and your plan will materialize into reality. So there you go. Now, the EPA. Let's start off with the history of the EPA, will you? Started off as a good idea, kind of, although the way it was kind of constructed and built and the charter really laid the foundation for its, shall we say, overreach now. And the American conversation about protecting the environment really began in the 1960s. Rachel Carson, you might know that name, but she published that famous book in 1962, Silent Spring, and it caught the country by storm. And it kind of spawned the environmental movement and unfortunately the rise of the environmental NGOs, which now are funded by Soros and China and who knows who else, anything to wreak havoc. And who are in bed, of course, with the government in terms of making a grab for your land through regulation, costs, and restriction. Well, if you remember back then, right before she wrote this book, there was a bunch of environmental catastrophes. There was that offshore oil rig in California that fouled the beaches with, you know, millions of gallons of spilled oil. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was so full of chemicals, flammable chemicals, that it literally spontaneously caught on fire. Then you had the Valdez incident a few years before up in Alaska, which was a wreck. So everybody was kind of primed for this, right? And President Nixon, you know, the more I get into him, the less I like this guy. Now remember, this is the same president who took us off the gold standard about a year after he formed the EPA. It's early 1970. And everybody's jumping up and down over these environmental concerns. I'm not saying rightfully, wrongfully. Obviously, they're environmental concerns. They need to be handled. It's how they're handled and who decides how they're handled and the heavy hand of enforcement that's involved in their handling that is the problem, particularly when there's an ulterior motive. But he formed a commission, and this commission met just for several months, and they recommended literally he formed them in like April of 1970. By July, they recommended that a new agency, of course, let's expand the government, be formed and kind of consolidate all the stuff the government had been doing or not doing in terms of environmental protections into one new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. And he went to the House and the Senate in 1970 once he got this commission report. And he started the ball rolling. He asked them to form the EPA. He asked for $4 billion, right? The pennies back then, and not even a penny now, for the improvement of water treatment facilities. He asked for national air quality standards, and he wanted stringent guidelines to lower motor vehicle emissions. Do you kind of see where all the nonsense today began? He wanted them to launch federally funded research to reduce automobile pollution. He wanted a cleanup of all the federal facilities that had supposedly fouled the air and water. He wanted legislation to end the dumping of wastes into the Great Lakes, a good thing, by the way. He proposed a tax on lead additives in gasoline. And he wanted Congress to put together a plan to tighten safeguards, if you will, on shipping petroleum products around the high seas. So the EPA was born, in fact, December 4th, 1970 to be exact, and its first executive director, its first administrator, as it's called, is William Ruckelshaus. You probably know that name. He took the oath of office December 4th, 1970. And the way Congress formed the EPA, they didn't give him the right to go hog wild. And they reserved the right for restrictions and regulations. But they gave him way too much latitude. You know, Congress is lazy. They got to be making money on the side, and they got to be working on their next reelection campaign. And, you know, other than that, the people's business kind of takes, not for all of them, but for many of them, kind of second fiddle, shall we say. So the way Congress formed this was the EPA would have the capacity to do research on important pollutants and the impact of those pollutants on the environment. And the EPA would monitor the condition of the environment, biological, physical, the whole 9 yards. And the EPA would establish baselines using these studies so that they had something to measure their progress on in terms of cleaning things up, you know, and regulating things down. And industries who would help the EPA to minimize kind of the adverse impact of their activities, well, they would be assured of consistent standards equally applied. Well, that kind of went by the wayside quickly. We'll be talking about that in the rest of the story. And they figured that as states developed and expanded their own pollution control programs, which most states have, and in fact, in the case of the blue states, shall we say, have, you know, jumped the Rubicon once again and gone way overboard, that they would look to this central agency to support their efforts with finance, technical assistance, training, etc. Well, that's kind of broken down, and we'll be talking about that in the rest of the story too. It's now devolved into litigation. And by the way, well, it should have way sooner. Congress, do your job. Unbelievable. Anyway, the EPA felt that its hands were still kind of tied. You know, I mean, once you create an agency and it's ever expansive and you start funding it with billions of dollars, which right now, I mean, it's, I don't know what their budget is. It is in the tens and tens and tens of billions. Their staff is outrageous and they continue to add to it. Kind of like the IRS, you know what I'm saying? But so EPA went back to Congress and using their Democratic allies, because they're all about control, folks, as we know, they got a whole bunch of things passed. Here's just a few. The bubble policy. That has to do with water quality. I won't even go into it right now. We'll talk about it another day. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Air Act of 1977. And the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I mean, you know, let's have 3 acts, all of them like 10,000 pages long with a whole bunch of other crap in them. The Clean Water Act, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, the NEPA. You've heard of NEPA, right? Yeah, right. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. In other words, if anything can kill anything else, they're going to control it. Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. Waters of the United States, which is really done in conjunction. The EPA is involved, but it's done in conjunction with the Interior Department and the Department of Agriculture and the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's a nasty, in many cases, design. I mean, all sorts of small people have been crushed by that. We'll talk about that when we get into the history of, shall we say, environmental controls next week, right? All these acts that different agencies administer and kind of link arms with secretly behind the scenes, and lately in conjunction with a corrupt Department of Justice, of course. And then the fishbowl policy, that's a fun one. And the Food Quality Protection Act, and the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, which is about ocean dumping, good thing, but once again, carried to the extremes. The National Environmental Policy Act, which by the way is NEPA, right? NEPA's supposed to control, they just go around NEPA with these other things. NEPA is kind of your touchstone act. Noise and Noise Control Act, Pollution Prevention Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Superfund Act, you've heard of Superfunds, the Toxic Substances Control Act. I mean, and on ad infinitum, you get the idea. But now for the rest of the story, okay, you got to feel for the EPA. And the EPA kind of works in conjunction with the federal government, unfortunately, because it was not their mission to crush small business and small landowners, and to, shall we say, usually, there are exceptions, look the other way when it comes to the big boys. The oligarchs who are arm in arm, it's called fascism, by the way, according to Mussolini, arm in arm with the government. Because when you wipe out small people, well, number one, you can take their property. But number two, you eliminate competition, which makes the big guys more profitable and bigger and bigger. And on goes the conundrum, on goes the catch-22, and on goes the incessant attack on the American people. So the justices right now at the Supreme Court are, in fact, the decisions on some of these are coming down literally. They may come down today while I'm talking. There was one horrible decision that came down today. We're going to talk about it, about free speech. Very disappointing, kind of a gut punch. But the justices are wrestling with the EPA power to curb carbon emissions. And that includes, of course, CO2, which, as we've discussed, last time I checked, is essential to life on Earth. And chemical makers have now sued just a month ago over a new rule to rid water of what the EPA terms forever chemicals. And the U.S. Supreme Court is weighing the EPA's authority to limit carbon emissions from power plants. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff up there. And we're going to get into at least one of these cases in the rat-a-tat-tat, because I'm going to have a land rat-a-tat-tat, some more things about what they're doing to grab your stuff. And then we're going to get into rat-a-tat-tat. And you radio listeners, we didn't get to rat-a-tat-tat the last 2 weeks. I apologize. We will get to rat-a-tat-tat for you today, okay? And what other stuff do they have going here? I mean, there is battle royales going everywhere. Half of the U.S. states, 25 Republican states, have joined together, and they're challenging another new, all this stuff is new, right? This is all a cascade of regulation and control. A new EPA rule which sets tougher standards for quote-unquote soot pollution. Okay, we'll see. And another group is gearing up to challenge the EPA on their new final auto industry regulations, which just came out in April, which basically says No more gas vehicles. I mean, I'm going to just summarize it for you. There's all sorts of wonky talk in there so they can wiggle their way around it when pressed. By 2032, right, we're all going to pay $60,000 for a nice EV car with no charging stations anywhere, a grid that won't supply the power, and digging up 500,000 cubic yards of dirt to make every battery. Sounds environmentally aware to me, don't you think? I'm glad the EPA is saving the environment, don't you think? And then there's Justice 40 at the EPA, okay? And this goes back to another executive order that Obama third term cadaver signed back in January of 2021. One of the first things he did when he got into office. You don't think that they've been thinking about this and they got a plan, huh? All right. Anyway, that order is Order 14008. You can look it up in the Federal Register. And it's called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. Oh, yeah. And that maintains, because we got to get some ESG and DEI in this environmental stuff, you know, folks. We got to be woke when we save the environment. That says that 40% of the benefits of federal investments, or certain federal investments, must flow to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. Because as you know, when you live in a disadvantaged community, your car never leaves the boundaries of that community. The river that comes through your community does not flow beyond your community. It just stops right there, folks. And the air in your community does not commingle with air in the other communities around you and in the other states and who knows where else. So why don't we just say this was the environmental tangent of buying their votes with your dollars. We're going to talk a little bit about taxes too, because there is a way, without resorting to the end result, depending upon how these elections go, there is a way maybe to get this fixed, you know, maybe. I wonder. And now let's talk about some of the land grabs that we haven't gotten to yet. Kind of make your blah blah pucker, shall we say, your eyebrows raise, and your jaw hit the table. So put a cushion down on the table, folks, because here we go. All right, let's talk about a little land grab stuff by your friendly government and their associated agencies, NGOs, and related oligarchs, shall we? But before we do, I want to bring to your attention, I mean, literally, as I'm recording this, the Supreme Court ruled on a really big case, Missouri versus Murphy. It was originally Missouri versus Biden. This case, this is kind of gut-wrenching, okay? I mean, it makes you shiver a little bit. And the fact that three conservative justices, Kavanaugh, Roberts, well, maybe he's a conservative, and Amy Coney Barrett, which is amazing, sided with the three liberal justices in deciding this is kind of breathtaking. Now, you could argue that it was on the technicalities of the law and the pleadings of the case, but in essence, this was the case that was brought by the Missouri Attorney General with the Louisiana Attorney General a year and a half or so ago that asked the court to enjoin the government telling social media to take down posts. You know, think of the Hunter Biden laptops, think of all the nonsense on COVID, the COVID jabs, ivermectin. I mean, I'm just giving you a few examples. To take down posts, to suppress the distribution of posts, and to take posts off the air because the government labeled it as misinformation, you know, like the Hunter laptop thing that didn't exist, you know, and ivermectin didn't help you, the Nobel Prize winning drug, whatever. Now, of course, all proven to be true. And the context under which the government took it down was, of course, politically founded and in violation of the people's right to know these really critical aspects. And they were downright lies. They were downright lies, every single one of them. And of course, the social media companies, other than X, good old Elon, are obviously very left leaning. I mean, Zuckerberg has committed election fraud. Google commits election fraud. I think it was found 41 occasions. I've brought you that story. So this is very troubling because the court said that the Fifth Circuit, which, by the way, the left thinks is very conservative, the Fifth Circuit was wrong, and the district court was wrong in enjoining the government telling social media companies to not post, to take down, to whatever, to censor. Okay, and this is really bad. I mean, it's really bad because unfortunately you have a lawless and illegitimate administration, and they're going to push this to the limit. Now, based on the opinions, they're not saying that the government can go out and censor Americans through media companies. They're just saying that in this case, there wasn't enough evidence, that had been done. And number two, that the parties who brought the complaint didn't have standing, i.e., they weren't the parties that were damaged. Okay, so we're dancing on the head of a legal pin here. The bottom line is whatever the justices intended, this is going to have to go back to the Supreme Court, unfortunately, after this election cycle. And you can imagine how the Biden administration, Obama's third term, I mean, the original PSYOPs guy, Barack Obama, and the left-leaning social media companies are going to use this as a shield going into the 2024 election. I mean, basically, anything to do with Trump, MAGA, America First, anti-Ukraine, anti-jab, whatever. I mean, I can go down the list, right? Anti-spending, fiscal restraint, voter integrity, election integrity. It's all going to be wiped out. And you're not going to be able to pass it on to others. What you're going to have to do, folks, is you're going to have to take shows like this and others, and you're going to have to cut and paste the address, and you're going to have to send it out to your friends. Because if you think you're going to get it out on social media after this ruling, even though I hope, eventually this will be solidified in the opposite direction when the technical legalities that seem to kind of pop up in this decision, which was written, by the way, by Amy Coney Barrett, of all people, are taken care of. I mean, the fact that there's censorship, the fact that the government directed it, has been proven time and time again. It just wasn't brought properly. At least I hope that's what the justices were thinking in this case. But in the meantime, we got a presidential election, and it's going to very detrimentally affect getting out news unless you directly pass on links to people in emails, because you ain't going to get it done on your Facebook page. Trust me. All right. Now, there was a bunch of other stuff. There are other rulings coming out of the Supreme Court here in the next 2 days. I just checked, and there's no others. There's one having to do with abortions in Idaho under emergency provisions, which the left is screaming about. I'm not going to bore you with that. Let's talk about what's happening on the land grab. The grab by the government and its oligarchical, treasonous compatriots for your personal and private property. And that includes your house, folks. That includes your house. I brought you all that news. So Wyoming and Utah have become the very first states. Good for them. Good for Wyoming. Mark Gordon, step up to the plate. That's great. Have become the first states to challenge federally an obscure rule which was just put in place by the Bureau of Land Management. I mean, this ties right into my show from last week, right? Bureau of Land Management. And it's a major shift, although they try and the BLM tries to downgrade it, of course. But basically, it effectively gives the BLM the power to kill off any project whatsoever, timber, mining, recreation, any type of extractive resource type project, just by making sure that their conservation NGO buddies, funded by China, Soros, Gates, and who knows who else, get to bid on the lease. And obviously, we all know who's going to win that bid, don't we? So good for them on challenging it. The Supreme Court, one of the rulings that they're on the verge of making, I was talking to you about this when we were talking about the EPA. This would drastically, if they rule right, and I hope it's not like this friggin' Missouri Murphy deal, it would drastically curtail the power of federal agencies, which absolutely, positively needs to be done. And it's based on a thing called the Chevron Deference Doctrine. And I don't want to get down in the weeds, but it's really kind of fascinating, okay? So this was a 1984 Supreme Court ruling, and it was Chevron USA, you know, the big boy, the big oil company, against Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the greenie groups. And basically, that decision said that the Supreme Court, that the courts throughout the land had to kind of bow down to the agency's interpretations of ambiguous statutes. Hey, Congress, do your job. I mean, how many times do I have to say that? Do your job. Can you write a clear statute? Can you make it clear that they can't do X, Y, and Z unless you approve it? Drives you crazy, man. Drives you crazy. And in the meantime, they're out making millions in the stock market. It's just terrific. I digress. So that kind of set the precedent up to now. Now, it looks like we're going to know in the next 24 to 48 hours. It looks like, and I may do a special if the court rules for freedom and for the Constitution and for private property. But it looks like the court's going to rule in a case called Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo and Relentless Inc. versus the Department of Commerce. It looks like the court may throw out the Chevron deference precedent, which would be terrific. The plaintiffs in this case, by the way, it's really kind of interesting. The plaintiffs in this case are two fishing companies, right? Think about how important this case is. And here's Middle America. This teaches you, this should demonstrate to you how important it is to stand up. If you have a claim, bring it. And we're going to talk a little bit about, and rat-a-tat-tat, some claims which have just, huge claims, which have just arisen that will affect most of you, okay? Concerning COVID and the jab and other stuff. Anyway, they're from New Jersey and Rhode Island. And there was a 2020 rule that the EPA just kind of threw out there, like they do, with no congressional oversight, like is typical. Congress, do your job. And it required these fishing companies to cover the costs of fishery management observers on their vessels. In other words, you had to have a government watchdog and you had to pay for them, right? Think about that. And they argued that this is an overreach. Well, obviously, it's an overreach, obviously. If the Supreme Court overturns the Chevron doctrine, that doctrine has been the cornerstone, the kind of pivot brick in the foundation of administrative law. That is, the agencies running amok, making their own rules, enforcements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to affect not only private property and land and houses and all sorts of things, but labor laws and environmental protection laws and all the way down the list. This is a huge case. I'm sorry I can't report to you as of this moment on how they've ruled. By the way, Justice Neil Gorsuch, obviously a Trump conservative, has suggested that Chevron, this doctrine, quote, deserves a tombstone no one can miss, unquote. So that tells you at least how some of the justices are feeling. And of course, the liberal justices think that it should remain in place because only the agencies in the government have the expertise to really get this right, you know? Yeah, like they get everything right. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about that pier. You know, I told you about it, I think 3 weeks ago, that the Biden administration spent $230 million of our money on over there in Gaza that has not worked, has not even come close to doing what they said it would do, and is now breaking up because it wasn't designed for waves in the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah, that's the government they say is more competent than anyone else to come up with the interpretation of vague law. Okay. Part of this, of course, can be taken care of if Congress takes the time to write laws which are not vague. Of course, that requires little work and time. And we certainly don't want to interfere with their golf games and their stock deals and all that kind of stuff, do we? No, not at all. All right. Iowa. This is a big deal. Okay, this is a deal that has erupted over fertilizer. Last week I told you about how the EPA is letting biosludge, which contaminates land, be used. In fact, they're promoting it, using our money to be used on farmland, which basically renders it worthless and infertile for quite some time. Then I guess the farm goes out of business, and what happens? Could it be that the government and their buddy oligarchs swoop in, or maybe China, sends $1 million check to Joe and off we go? Yep, you bet. Something like that. But anyway, there's only 4 companies in the United States, believe it or not. This is the big getting bigger and the small getting smaller, as we've discussed, which is intentional. There's only 4 companies. They supply 75% of nitrogen, which is a key ingredient in fertilizer. Now, our ranch doesn't happen to use fertilizers. We're totally holistic. We only use manure and only from the livestock that graze here, and we brush it in and all sorts of stuff. I don't want to bore you with that. Most places do use fertilizer, and it does increase crop yield. I happen to not believe in it, so I don't. But many farmers and ranchers rely on it. I mean, it's the key to them making it or not making it, which, by the way, is a key to the price you're going to pay at the supermarket for all sorts of food, goods, and commodities. There's direct linkage here. Well, it seems that there's a Dutch company that owns Iowa Fertilizers. And it seems that the United States government has spent $500 million of our money, our tax money, there we go, it's easy come, easy go, to modernize a plant for them. And it's an American company, but it's a Dutch owner. And now, now the Koch brothers, C-O or Koch, depending upon how you want to call it, K-O-C-H, the big rhinos that used to support Republican causes. They want to buy the Koch brothers, I'm reminded here in my earpiece. The Koch brothers want to buy the Iowa fertilizer plant. And, of course, they happen to be one of those 4 companies, which are the 4 largest in the United States already. Well, the Iowa farmers and ranchers are up in arms, understandably so. Where that's going to come, I don't know. Do you know how all this arose? This was Joe Biden's, a la Barack Obama third term. It was his plan to, quote, drive competition across several industries and lower prices for the consumer, unquote. Oh, I guess another failed plan by Biden-Obama team. Okay. Then we have the BLM proposing all sorts of rules, along with the EPA, by the way, which govern the BLM is attacking the extraction of minerals and fuels, including gas, oil, coal, etc. The EPA is attacking the emissions, and the soot just brought you that. So you can see this 1-2 punch. Don't think this isn't totally coordinated. Of course it is. Of course it is. And once again, we have Wyoming back in the spotlight. Our governor is finally kind of stepping up to the plate. Some disappointing things he's done, but there's some things that he's doing which are right too. And Wyoming has a big stake, as do all the Western states, particularly. Remember, most of BLM's land is in the West. A big stake with BLM's approach to how they manage public lands. For instance, just in Wyoming, there's 18.4 million acres of public lands and 42.9 million acres of federal lands, and 245 million, if you remember last week's history of the BLM, 245 million acres that they manage around the country. I mean, that is a chunk of dirt, and 700 million acres of mineral rights, subsurface rights under the land, which is like 30% of the land area of the United States. So you can see when they tinker with the rules and Congress has been vague or Congress doesn't step up to the plate, what kind of catastrophe can happen when you have NGOs, self-interested oligarchs, an ideological government, and globalists who want to own your stuff in control of these agencies, which they are, period. Let me say it again, period. Okay. Anyway, the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule, which was only unveiled for public comment April 3rd, kind of became the law, even though it's not the law and it's unconstitutional. Congress, do your job. In late April, early May. And this is the law that basically allows Tracy Stone Manning, the director of BLM and woke, to determine that conservation outfits can bid on federal leases instead of mining companies, or along with mining companies, cattle interests, and other types of things, other types of entities. And as I've said a million times, you know who's going to win that contest. It's hands down, right? Hands down. So it's really not letting conservation outfits bid. It's really getting together with them clandestinely behind the scenes and saying, hey, we want this off the market. We want this oil out of here. We want this shut down. This lease is coming up, so go ahead and bid on it. And then they outbid everybody, obviously. And the government's communist and control mission is accomplished, and they can just say, well, we didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't bid on it. They bid on it. You know, kind of like when the enviro groups bring a lawsuit, the Justice Department defends it, and then the Justice Department reaches a settlement, which basically gives the enviro groups everything they want. Don't think that is a wink and a nod deal, too. It is. You know, it's all psyops. And I might add that in promulgating that new rule, BLM totally sidestepped NEPA, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, because NEPA is supposed to control the first review of any rules like that, anything that affects the quote unquote environment. And they just went right around it. And of course, the EPA didn't say anything. And of course, Congress is out busy campaigning. So heaven forbid they should say anything about rules and regulations promulgated because they wrote a lousy law and they didn't control the promulgators thereafter. It's all very frustrating, actually. All very frustrating. By the way, the name of that Dutch company that owns the Iowa fertilizer deal is OCI Global. Okay, and it's Iowa Fertilizer Company. You should check it out. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for your pocketbook, let me tell you. All right, let's talk about some rat-a-tat-tat, shall we? And I'm just going to interject. I'm going to have a pretty big announcement, both on the radio and these video channels here in the next week or two. So stay tuned for that. I think, well, some of you won't like it, but some of you may like it very much. We shall see. And some of it has to do with this incredibly disappointing decision today by the Supreme Court on Missouri versus Murphy, and the government jumping in and telling social media, left-wing social media companies who were leaning that way anyway, to take that down, don't post this, blah, 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 you know. In other words, subjectively labeling anything which doesn't suit their political ambitions at the time as illegitimate and misinformation. I mean, we've all heard it, right? We've been hearing the drumbeat for, well, we heard the drumbeat for 8 years while Barry was in office, and we've been hearing the drumbeat incessantly, really, since then, and accentuated exponentially when Cadaver was elected and Barry got back in for his third term. All right, enough on that. Rat-a-tat-tat, which I promised. And that includes you radio folks out there in radio land. I think we're going to start off with economics, shall we? And I have a lot more rat-a-tat-tat. I'm not going to get it all in the radio part of this show, but you'll be able to pick it up on the video channels, right? Read Lance Rosenthal, The Cowboys Take. Those of you on radio want to hear the rest of the rat-a-tat-tat. Okay, the economy is kind of key, right? Kind of your life, it's your property, it's your ability to afford things, it's your ability to eat, have a roof over your head, those key necessities to life, and they're lying to you incessantly. I've been telling you this for years. It's really bad in the last 6 months because they want things to look so good for the election, you know. Yep, they sure do. So core inflation, right? It seems that the core inflation rate that was posted a couple of months ago, which showed core inflation coming down, that was revised so that it didn't come down, it went up. But, you know, who's looking at that because now you're fixated on what's going on today? Real interest rates. Let's talk about this. You know, everybody says, these treasury bills are just great. It's 5 or 5 1/4, and, you know, it's a safe place to park your money. Well, number one, I'm not so sure the United States Treasuries are a safe place to park your money, particularly for the long term, but that's a whole nother discussion. There seems to be a whole bunch of countries out there who are joining the BRICS who agree, unfortunately, and we created that intentionally, but yet another tale. Real interest rates, folks, I want you to keep this in mind. If you have an inflation rate, right now, shadowstatistics.com, they're your friend. Check them out. They're saying real inflation's around 9 or 10%. It was up around 17 or 18, so it's down, but it's still ridiculously high. So if you take $1 and you put it in a bank or a money market or a treasury bill, and you're getting 5%, first of all, good for you. And secondly, what are you really making on that dollar? Aren't you losing 5%? If inflation is decreasing the value of the dollar at 10% a year, and you're only getting 5% interest, when I do my cowboy math, that comes out to a 5% negative. It's something to think about, particularly as we continue these economic discussions in the future. You'll see why it ties in. There's some great videos, by the way, on all these topics that I've been covering today on therightsideradio.com. On therightsideradio.com. And please take a look at them. They are from all sorts of great sources, true experts in their fields, and all the articles that I'm talking about now and talked about in the land grab section and the EPA, I even have EPA links up there so you can learn more about them, are on the website, as is our custom every week. All right, so June 11th, right? Why is that a magic date? Well, a year ago, June 11th, because, you know, you got to let it kind of disappear into the dust so nobody thinks about it. The SEC passed a rule. And the SEC basically says that money markets, think about this, folks who have money in money markets, can put the brakes on withdrawals. Oh, well. And you thought you could get your money out anytime you want. No, the SEC passed that rule a year ago, and it just came into effect June 11th. You know, under the radar, except for people like me. They must love me up there. In any event, keep that in mind if you have money in money markets. If SHTF hits suddenly, don't be thinking that you might be able to withdraw all your money from the money market in one fell swoop. Consumer debt, okay? This excludes the explosion in the buy now, pay later plans, which, by the way, are now in the billions. And those outfits are resisting disclosure, saying they're not bound by the banking rules and regulations. Well, we'll see about that in the future. But 330 billion in consumer debt in 2021, at the end of 2021, has now ballooned to 1.2 trillion in consumer debt. This includes credit cards, 20 to 29%, that'll screw you up pretty damn quick. And 43% of the folks who are in the buy now, pay later plans apparently have gone into default over the last 90 days. They aren't paying. Savings, all that money that you and I paid for, that they printed, that they sent out to everybody buying votes and getting us ready for universal income and direct government subsidies of people. You'll own nothing and you will be happy. That whole deal in 2020 and 2021. Well, that created a big surge in savings, right? People are locked down because, unfortunately, they went along with what the government illegally and unconstitutionally, as later ruled by the courts, told them they had to do. They forgot those words, no, I will not comply. And that boosted the savings of American households by 2.1 trillion. That's a huge jump. That's the good news. The bad news is that 2.1 trillion has now dwindled to basically nothing and is decreasing further. Think about people going in the hole now because of inflation, which the government says is coming down, and it's only, like 3%. Don't you worry your pretty little heads about anything. 72 billion a month. That's negative savings rate, folks. 72 billion a month. That's a lot of people needing a lot of money just to live, right? There's now a 7.7% default rate on mortgages. 7.7%. This is nearing the percentages, not there yet, in 2008, 2009, which is all fresh in basically all our memories, whatever your age listening to this broadcast. And the default rate is way up, right? That's way up. And mortgages that are seriously underwater, this means your house is worth less than your mortgage, has increased to 2.6 to 2.7% of all houses in the United States. Now, let's go back to our thesis on property and how they're making it untenable to own so that they can own it and you can be their tenant. Think about all these things I'm bringing you. By the way, the three worst states, and it kind of shocked me, is Kentucky, Wyoming, and West Virginia. And those are all in the double digits, above 7.7%, in terms of houses underwater. I was really surprised. Now, Wyoming may be skewed by Teton County, Jackson Hole, where people paid, $5 million for a house. Now it's only worth $4 million, those poor people. And they're $1 million underwater on the value. But nonetheless, it's an interesting little sidelight here. Transportation and transport, right? This is the movement of goods, services, and people across the country. Plane, truck, you name it. This is kind of the arteries of the economy, right? Carries all the goods and services to everybody everywhere. They are down. They surveyed all the transportation mucky mucks, and they're down 50 to 70%. That includes UPS, FedEx, you name it. Now think about what a dramatic reduction in business that is for the transport of goods and materials to be down that kind of percentage. By the way, May housing inventory. Okay, all you people go, oh no, this house is great. Look, folks, it's just economics. It's just cycles. There's no way out of it. It's just math. I mean, you'd be far better off to recognize reality, prepare yourself for it, have a plan, do what you have to do, than to pretend, be an ostrich, and pretend none of this is happening. That doesn't do you any good. because when it catches up with you, you have no latitude, you have no time, you're done. And BlackRock will own your house and you'll write them a rent check. So May inventory is up 6.7%, right? That's up 18.5% year over year. That's a big jump in housing inventory, even though it was coming from a low kind of level, if you will. There was a 5%, believe it or not, even in the face of that, a 5% price increase year to year, year over year in houses in May. $419,000 median price house, which only a small fraction of the population can now afford, particularly at 7% mortgage rates. So what does that tell you about the future of sales and the future viability of the housing market until things kind of correct themselves and values get real and interest rates hopefully get real? I think they're going to go up myself. Sales, by the way, are down 2.8% year over year. So I think about all these conflicting numbers. None of them, by the way, spelling anything to have a parade about when it comes to housing. How's that? And that was a 0.7% drop from April. That's almost 1% in 1 month. That's big, particularly since April, May, June are kind of, they're beginning the peak, if they're not the peak of the sales season, depending upon what market you're in. And new home sales just came out today for May, and they're down 6.7%, which is way above the expectations of a slight decline. So this is hitting both existing homes and new homes, right? And the new homes, remember, are offering incentives. We'll buy down your interest rate, we'll give you these options, we'll do this, that, and the other. So that's a big deal. And listen, when the canary tips over in the coal mine and you're down there mining coal, it might be time to get to the elevator shaft and get out into fresh air. Just saying. I'm not your financial advisor. On the international front, Thailand. We're very close with Thailand in a lot of ways. We even have a mutual defense pact with them. Thailand, remember last week I told you about the Saudis letting the petrodollar agreement of the last 50 years expire. I mean, that's going to have huge ramifications, let me tell you. You wait and see. But Thailand just said they want to join the BRICS. Terrific. Is there anybody left in the world with our current leadership in quotes, who even likes America or Americans anymore? We'll have to think about that. I mean, there's a bunch of countries that won't even honor the passport anymore. I'll bring you that story another time. All right, folks, let's say we wrap up the show, shall we? Sorry about the flapping papers there on the right-hand side, but, you know, we all have to have our notes. Yes, we do. Let's go with some really good. I think that paper needs some stiffening agent. What do you think? Let's go with some really incredible COVID jab update news, shall we? This is really big news. Once again, proves the conspiracy theories. You know, we're conspiracy theories. And it proves the censorship thing we were just talking about and the very poor ruling by the Supreme Court today. Very disappointing. And it also goes right to COVID litigation for those of you who have claims. And many of you do, you don't even know it. And those of you who do, bring them. Okay? Accountability is the key to cutting this nonsense out. And there's lots of attorneys out there that will handle it on a contingency basis. They'll take a cut of the award, and it will cost you basically nothing. Give it some serious thought. It is, I got to tell you, the American thing to do, and it's probably good for the rest of the people on the planet too, because all of us were subject to that medical tyranny, censorship, and conjure, I'll be kind. Fraud is what it was. So, so the Lancet used to be a really well-reputed medical journal with all sorts of scientific articles. They were caught in all sorts of censorship and nonsense during the COVID thing. They recently published a peer-reviewed article and then took it down like in a week because Big Pharma got on their butt. And guess who gives them a lot of money? Yeah, money. And they took it down in a week, but it's been republished under Natural Sciences. And this is about 20 huge researchers and doctors from around the world. I mean, these are big names from McCullough to you name it. And guess what they found in doing, I guess, thousands of autopsies of people who died from COVID? They didn't die from COVID, folks. 73.4% died from the COVID jab. Let me repeat that. 73.4% died from the COVID jab. I don't know if we're going to have the study up for you, but we're going to have the articles up for you. And from those articles you can get and you can read the study yourself. I suggest if you have any friends, loved ones, or yourself who's been injured or heaven forbid, you lost somebody to this really crime against humanity, that you take action, okay? And it'll be on the COVID litigation page, the COVID page, and under Rat-a-tat-tat and family safety on therightsideradio.com. Along those lines, which also strengthens your litigation claims tremendously, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals 2 or 3 weeks ago, I just haven't had time to bring you the story, basically ruled, I mean, they came within a gnat's eyelash of ruling that the COVID vaccines, vaccines have a legally defined, they're a legally defined term under the law. And they ruled that these jabs were not vaccines. Now, think about the fact that the limitations of liability, unfortunately signed by Reagan in '86, pertain to vaccines, and that's back when vaccines really were vaccines, not gene therapy drugs. So this is a huge ruling. First of all, you can get to the drug companies and the folks who had mandates and the government, etc., because it was all fraudulent. All this stuff's coming out now, all their nonsense, the masks, the 6 foot of separation, the safe and effective on the jabs, the, no adverse consequences, the lack of informed consent, the experimental drug never approved. I can go, I'm not going to bore you with the list. That's fraud. And that also breaches their immunity. But if you take that and you couple it with the ruling by the Fifth Circuit, we'll see if it stands, we'll see if it's solidified, that these are not vaccines. Well, you have no immunity for a drug that's not a vaccine. None. There's been billions upon hundreds of billions paid out by drug companies on drugs that are not vaccines. So something you should look at. That article will be posted also for you. And then we have, well, big surprise, voter fraud. Yeah. And I'm going to bring you more of this next week because lots of things are already starting to pop up. Big surprise. And of course, they'll now be covered up because of this lousy Supreme Court decision today. And you won't be able to write about it or tell your friends about it unless you send direct links and emails, etc. And even then, they better check their spam because Google or Yahoo or whoever will relegate them to the spam folder to make sure you don't see them. Yeah, I mean, down to that level of censorship. So the Alabama Secretary of State, his name is Wes Allen. It seems that Biden, Obama's third term, is now providing illegal aliens with a mechanism to register to vote. And if you don't think this whole border thing was planned, do you know when he signed this executive order? It's Executive Order 14019, and you can look it up in the Federal Register. So let me quote Wes Allen, the AG. Quote, "It weaponizes and mobilizes the entire federal government apparatus to become voter registration agencies." Of course, using your tax dollars again. We have to have more discussion on tax dollars, and we will. To go into more details on this, this order not only allows, it mandates that federal agencies, and this includes Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, you name it, anything that's giving out the dole, welfare, okay, your tax money, again, to illegal aliens, by the way. It mandates those agencies, including, by the way, the agencies that oversee immigration and naturalization. Can you spell DHS? That's supposed to be in charge of the border. To prioritize, listen to this now, to prioritize the identification and registration of non-citizens as voters. Do I need to repeat that? Does it even surprise you? Yeah. Anyway, this is a rather radical departure from the Constitution, and in my mind it's treason, but they've committed lots of other treason, so that's really no surprise. West Allen discovered this because they found that state agencies in Alabama, like Medicaid and welfare offices that receive funds from the federal government, were required to provide voter registration forms to anyone who comes in contact with that agency under what's called the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act. Once again, Congress, like, where are you at on this? Hello? Knock, knock? Anybody home? Fix it before the election. Wow, unbelievable. Or at least you can out the Democrats who don't let you fix it to make it clear to anybody with half a living brain cell what's going on here. I mean, it's unbelievable. Anyway, I want to wish all of you the happiest July 4th. You have a great time with your family, your friends, your hot dogs, your hamburgers, your fishing, your ATVing out on the trails, your hiking in the parks, whatever you plan to do. But remember what July 4th is. And you can go into the archives of ontherightsideradio.com, and I've brought several stories. Just type in July 4th or Independence Day about the founders, the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence back there in 1776, putting their lives, many of which lost their lives, on the line, pledging their faith, their honor, and their fortunes to each other, knowing they were committing treason. But remember, anything in defense of the Constitution and in defense of man and his individual rights is not treason. Anything contrary to those principles is treason. And everyone needs to be held accountable. But remember what July 4th is while you munch on your hot dog and play with your kids or see the relatives or barbecue with friends. It's more than just a day at a picnic. Way more. And we owe a huge debt to those men back there and women who had the courage to stand against tyranny. I hope that you and I and all the people we know have that same courage now. You have a great July 4th. Keep the wind at your back, and we'll talk to you next week.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Read Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.